Our next speaker is Judge Bobby Chastain. Judge Chastain was admitted to the bar in 1969. He practiced all over, everywhere they had a courtroom for a long time. He was a state bar president. His commitment to the law and public service earned him the Justice Thomas O. Marshall Professionalism Award. He was elected to the Superior Court of the Cordele Judicial Circuit in 2004, and he's been serving on the bench since that time. Please welcome Judge Chastain.
Thank you. I'm still aggravated at Jim for stepping down as a Superior Court judge, because when we'd have our meetings, he was the one I palled around with. Because I spent a lot of time in Valdosta, primarily because I have 3 grandchildren that live here. In fact, I got to go home today, change clothes, and come back down here for a playoff game tonight. My youngest grandson is a senior this year, but it's an honor and a privilege to be asked to speak at this event. I've been blessed to practice law for 35 years, and I've been on the bench for 20 years. And I've been blessed to do that right here in South Georgia. And I say South Georgia because I'm proud of South Georgia. I started practicing law in 1969 with my brother-in-law, Ben Mills. And I was actually supposed to go back to Ocilla to practice with Emory Walters. I had worked with him during law school, but my father-in-law, Carlisle McDonald, who was Ben's partner, passed away during my last year of law school, and Ben asked me if I'd come back and practice with him, so that's what I did, and we enjoyed practicing together for 35 years. And as I look back, I've been fortunate to practice before some very good judges. When I started practicing law, there was only one judge for the Cordele Circuit, and that was Judge William Leroy McMurray, Jr. And I couldn't have asked to practice before a better judge to start out. He called me on October the 13th of 1969, and he said, "You passed the bar." I don't know how I would have found out. I guess maybe they'd have mailed me a letter. We didn't have internet and all that sort of stuff in 1969. He said, "I'll be over this afternoon and swear you in." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And so he came over and swore me in. And then back then, I didn't realize this, but the youngest lawyer in town was the public defender. They didn't have a public defender's office back then. You got all the appointed cases. So he immediately started assigning me to cases, like Bill said. And even if you went to another circuit, they didn't mind appointing you to a case there. I'd go down to Irwin County, and the lawyers would be sitting over there, and somebody would need a lawyer, and the judge would say, Judge Gray would say, "Just look over there and pick you out one of those lawyers," and all the lawyers would squat down like this, and hoping that he didn't see us, And I remember one guy that said, he looked over there and he looked back at the judge, he said, "I think I'll just represent myself." And I represented all the juveniles and their parents. I think it's funny now. They tell me, and I don't know because I don't practice in juvenile court, but they say that the juvenile has to have a lawyer, and his parents have to have a lawyer, and if the parents are separated, they have to have separate lawyers. So that's 3 lawyers. I don't know how I got by with representing everybody, but it was a great experience. Judge McMurray was a former FBI agent, and he always carried a pistol in a shoulder holster. And I kidded him when we'd try a criminal case. You might say he was sort of a law and order judge, because he'd look over at the state and he'd say, "Are we ready?" And I'm like, "Are we ready?" I mean, I'm thinking, is the state ready? Not, are we ready? But I love trying cases in front of Judge McMurray. He was always fair and very considerate. He also was a stickler about courtroom attire. I remember one time I was trying a case, and the Ben Hill County Courthouse didn't have air conditioning in the courtroom. They'd raise the windows, and they had those big ceiling fans. And I got hot. I mean, my shirt was almost sticky. And so I was examining the witness, and I just took my coat off, and I hung it on my chair, and I kept on going. In a few minutes, Judge McMurray called a recess, and he said, Mr. Chastain, I'd like to see you in chambers. And I said, yes, sir. And so we went back there. He didn't want to embarrass me, but he said, you're going to have to put your coat back on. I said, well, it's hot. He said, well, I'm hot too, but you're going to have to put your coat back on. So I put my coat back on, but I found that rule didn't apply to everybody. His wife was Rosemary McMurray. He called Rose, a beautiful lady, sweet lady. But she came to the courthouse down there, and she wore big hats. You know, those big hats that women used to wear a long time ago. And you couldn't wear a hat in the courtroom. And so she didn't tell the bailiff that she was Judge McMurray's wife. And he said, you're going to have to take that hat off. And she said, well, I'd like to see the judge. So the bailiff goes back there, and he tells the judge that this lady's out there with this big hat on, but she won't take it off to come in the courtroom. And he said, well, let me just say this. It'd probably be in your best interest and my best interest to let her come in. So Judge McMurray's wife came in with her hat on. She's the only one I've seen with a hat on in the courtroom. When Judge McMurray was appointed to the Court of Appeals, Judge Hardy Gregory took his place. And before he was appointed to the bench, he practiced in Vienna, Georgia with T. Hoyt Davis in the firm of Davis, Gregory, Christie, and Forehand. He was also a graduate of the Naval Academy. He was probably one of the smartest judges I practiced before. He would ask you to brief an issue about something, and you would do all this research, not on a computer, in books. And you do all this research, and then you'd send him a brief, and then he'd give you an order, and he'd cite cases in there I'd never heard of before. I hadn't even seen those cases. But I remember one time I had a case before him that it was about child support, and I was representing the wife, and the husband hadn't been paying the child support, so I had him on the stand, and I found out he had a good job, and I said, well, why aren't you paying your child support? And he said, because I ain't going to pay no child support. And so I was hoping to maybe clarify this, and I said, I started to say something else, and Judge Gregory said, Mr. Chastain, you can sit down. Sheriff, he held him in contempt and sent him right to jail. Well, this is how you can tell how much your mother loves you. I went back to the office, and his mother was there with the money to pay all the back child support, which was several $1,000s. So I called Judge Gregory, and he said, well, he probably needs to spend a night in jail tonight. If you got all that money, he said, you can draw an order and let him out tomorrow. So, as far as I know, he never got behind in his child support after that. But anyway, Judge Gregory, I see him frequently. He still lives in Vienna, out on a Pennahatchee plantation out there. And this past spring, the Department of Natural Resources honored him as Conservationist of the Year for his work in bobwhite quail restoration. He's got a big plantation up there where he's done a lot of things for bobwhite quail. And then after Judge Gregory was appointed to the Supreme Court, Judge Whitfield Forrester took the bench, and Judge Forrester had practiced law in Cordele, and he's what I call a gentleman's gentleman. He was just really a great person, but he was an avid turkey hunter and deer hunter. And I remember on one occasion I had a friend that he'd gotten a jury notice, and he'd paid for a pheasant hunting trip out in Nebraska. And he went to the clerk, and she said she couldn't excuse him, that he needed to see Judge Forrester if he wanted to get excused. And so he was real nervous. And he asked me, he said, will you go with me? And I said, sure, because I knew what the judge was going to do. But anyway, he was nervous. I didn't say anything to him, but we went in Judge Forrester's chambers, and I said, you tell him what you need. And so he explained to him that he'd paid for this hunting trip to hunt pheasants out in Nebraska, and that he'd gotten that jury summons, and he really needed to get off jury duty. And so he looked at Judge Forrester, and Judge Forrester said, well, what are you waiting on? That was it. I knew it. And another time we had a bar meeting. I think it was out at Daphne's Lodge at Lake Blackshear. And prior to the dinner, there was a cocktail reception. And a couple of members of the bar, I think, might have had too much to drink. So later on in the evening, they got into an argument, which eventually led to some punches being thrown. And so Judge Forrester sent word that we could continue to have bar meetings, but there would be no alcohol served at the meetings. And I thought, well, that's going to really affect the attendance of our meetings. We can't have alcohol meetings. So I represented a bank back then, and I would occasionally have a non-judicial foreclosure, which required that you report the sale to the court if you wanted to seek a deficiency judgment. And each time when I took Judge Forrester the petition to do that, and he'd say, "What poor widow woman are you foreclosing on today?" But it was a pleasure to practice for Judge Forrester. I had a case, I don't know, back years ago, I don't know whether they do that as much now, but in a temporary hearing in a divorce case, they would file all these affidavits. I don't know whether the judge read them or not. But I had a temporary hearing in a divorce case, and my law partner had a guy that worked at his house, did yard work, named Bobby Hillman. And I told him, I said, "Look, if you see Bobby Hillman, tell him I want him to do some yard work at my house." He said, "Okay." Well, about a week later, Bobby Hillman showed up at the office, and my secretary buzzed me and said, "Bobby Hillman's out here in the waiting room, and he said he wants to see you." And I said, "Oh, great." So I jumped up. He always rode a bicycle, and so I went up there and I said, "Did you ride your bicycle up here?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, just park it on the front porch, and I'm going to go get my car, and I'll pick you up." So I did. I went up there and picked him up, and I carried him to the house, and I showed him what I wanted him to do, and I got all the tools and everything. And then at lunchtime, I came back and brought him some lunch, and he worked all day. And then at 5 o'clock, I went back and picked him up, and we were riding back to my office, and I said, "Look, if you don't have anything to do tomorrow," I said, "I got some more yard work you can do." And he either dipped snuff or chewed tobacco or something, and he said, "I came up there to do an affidavit for Lynn Thornton." I had a case, I was representing Lynn Thornton, and I told him he had to get some affidavits, and he had sent Bobby Hillman up to my office to sign an affidavit, and I made him work in my yard all day. Well, word got out about that, and they said, "Don't go to Bobby Chastain's office to sign an affidavit." And so after that, I think Judge Forrester must have heard about that, because I'd filed a bunch of affidavits, and he said, "Your yard must be really in good shape." And I said, "Sir?" He said, "You filed a bunch of affidavits." He said, "You make all these people work in your yard before you..." I said, "No, sir, I didn't do that." Anyway, when the circuit was authorized to have a second judge, G. Malin Faircloth was appointed to fill the position, and Judge Faircloth and I had played football against each other in high school. He played for Cordele, and I played for Fitzgerald High School. He went on to play football at Tennessee, where he was the last single-wing quarterback in Tennessee history. In fact, when they had their 100-year celebration of Tennessee football, he was voted one of the top 20 running backs in Tennessee history. Well, while he was serving on the bench, he took up running and would enter a lot of road races, and I was a runner, and I was also entering a couple of road races, and we ran the Peachtree Road Race a couple of times. But then at some point, he injured his knee and couldn't run anymore, so he took up biking. Well, then he wanted to enter some biathlons, and he enlisted me to do the running, and he would do the biking. I remember one time in Macon, he told me this. He said, "This is what I want you to do," because I'd run first and then he'd bike. He said, "I want you to go out the first mile in a 5:30 pace and then bring it down from there." It was a 5K run, and I looked at him and I said, "If I run the first mile at a 5:30 pace, there won't be a second mile." On another occasion, he decided he wanted to enter the assault on Mount Mitchell, which is a 100-mile bike ride from Spartanburg, South Carolina to the top of Mount Mitchell, North Carolina. And you have 12 hours to do it. And the elevation changes from about 800 feet to about 6,400 feet. Well, since he's the judge, it's kind of hard for me to refuse. So to prepare, you have to do a lot of long rides. And he calls me one day and he says, "You have the last hearing for me today in Fitzgerald." It was a temporary hearing in a divorce case. And he said, after the hearing, we can ride to Rochelle and back, which is about 46 miles. It's kind of hard to say no. The hearing was a temporary hearing, and I represented the husband. After the hearing, he made his ruling, which I thought was a little unfair to my client. And we leave the courthouse and go to my house to change clothes and start our ride. As we're riding along, he pedals up by him. I ain't saying anything. And he says, "Are you pouting about my ruling?" And I say, "No, I'm pouting because I'm having to ride with your ass all the way to Rochelle and back." Now, Mount Mitchell is the highest mountain east of the Mississippi River, and if you ever think you want to do that, I'll tell you how to practice for this ride. What you do is take your bicycle seat off and just ride on that post for about 3 or 4 weeks, because that's what it'll feel like when you get to the top. Now, Judge Fairclough decided he wanted to do a 3-day, 2-night paddle through the Okefenokee Swamp. Again, he volunteered me to go. The first day you paddle to a wooden platform, and that's where you spend the night, the first night. And we get there, and there's a sign up there on that platform that clearly says, "Don't feed the alligator." So I look out there, and Judge Fairclough's out there throwing Cheetos. There's about a 14-foot alligator out there. And I think, well, so somebody in our group, the alligator, eventually it gets dark, and the alligator is under the platform, but his snout sticking out about that far on this side over here. And somebody decided to make a lasso and try to lasso his snout down there. And so finally Judge Fairclough came over and he said, "Y'all don't know what you're doing. Get out of the way." So he lies down on the platform and he reaches over to the side and he grabs the alligator by the head. When he does, the alligator's tail comes up underneath there and knocks a board loose. And I said, "Oh, Lord, we're going to sink. This platform's going to sink, and I'm going to be eaten by a gator." And the headline in the Fitzgerald newspaper is going to be, "Local lawyer dies eaten by a gator." But anyway, I don't think I closed my eyes the rest of the night. And I could tell some more stories about Judge Fairclough. It was a real adventure practicing for him, but I loved to do it. He was a good judge. The last judge I want to talk about is Judge John Pridgeon. He was the district attorney before I took the bench, and I enjoyed working with Judge Pridgeon when he was the district attorney. And then shortly after I took the bench, he came to me with an order in a case, and he told me to sign it. I hadn't been on the bench that long. And he said, "I was a DA when this case came up, but I've looked at it and I've prepared this order. You can sign it." So I did. Well, about 8 months later, I get a notice from the Court of Appeals that I've been reversed. And I looked at it and I asked my secretary, I said, "I don't remember this case. I don't even remember this name." She said, "Oh, you don't remember that?" She said, "That was the one that Judge Pridgeon got you to sign the order." So I had my first reversal, and I called him and I said, "Look, I'm sure I'll do plenty on my own to get reversed without any help from you." On another occasion, we had an attorney from another circuit that came and had a hearing in Fitzgerald, and she asked the bailiff prior to the hearing, she said, "Who's going to be on the bench today?" And he said, "Judge Pridgeon." And she said, "Oh, you mean Judge Grumpy?" From that point, we affectionately called Judge Pridgeon Judge Grumpy. I called him one day about an order I was about to enter to get his perspective on it. And after I explained it to him, I went through detail about it and all. I said, "Well, I just wanted to be sure I wasn't being an SOB." And he said, "I didn't say you weren't an SOB. I just said I agreed with your ruling." That was real confidence. I really appreciated that. But I enjoyed serving on the bench with Judge Pridgeon for 12 years, and not once during that time did we ever have a disagreement. He was a great friend. But as I look back, I've been blessed to practice before some really good judges, and I've also been blessed to serve with some judges in all over the state. It's been in the words of Jimmy Buffett, some of it's been magic, some of it's been tragic, but it's been a fun ride all the way. Thank you.